All right, and we're back.
Hey.
All right, this is exciting to do. We've been wanting to get these finished for a while, so I'm glad to be back. Unfortunately, I had to do them with Hall over here, but we all make sacrifices for the things we want, so here we go.
Oh, dear.
All right, so this whole chapter that we're going to be your study guide that we're going to be focusing on is about the executive branch. Now, at the top, as always, there are some key vocab terms that you guys really need to go through. And we'll just go through those really quick. So we got electoral college, we have enumerated powers, we have ambassadors, State of the Union address, implied powers, executive order, executive agreement, War Powers Act, chief executive, chief diplomat, head of state, commander-in-chief, legislative leader, economic leader, political leader, cabinet, pardon, treaty, trade sanctions, embargo, primary election, general election, and doctrine.
Okay, so if we jump in, we can actually see that if you want to become a president, there's really just three things that are in place for you to qualify. So you have to be at least 35 years old. When they say you have to be a native-born American citizen, that means you were born in the U.S., you couldn't be born in Austria and then come over here and get naturalized, okay? And then, of course, you must have lived in the U.S. for at least 14 years, okay? So now when you go down, you'll look to see where it's talking about electing a president. Do you want to go ahead and talk about that?
Yeah, perfect. So elections, guys, they take place every 4 years. So every 4 years you have a potential election. Now, the president is not chosen directly by the voters, but instead a group called the Electoral College. And each state has a certain number of electors. Now, there have been changes recently, which basically state that the Electoral College, they have to vote with the way the people in their regions vote.
Correct. In the past, when the Republicans would go and select their Electoral College voters, they assumed they would vote Republican. However, if that Electoral College member decided that they did not want to vote for the person they claimed they would vote for, they didn't have to. But now the Supreme Court, like Mr. Halpin said, has made it to where if you are there to vote for this specific person and the state votes for that person, then that's who you're voting for.
Exactly. And of course, it went the other way too, with of course, the other way, the other political side. Now, to win the election, a candidate must have at least half those electoral votes, which is 538 of the voters, the total number. So they have to have 270 votes.
So that key number is 270. Now, when you look at the term of office, when you are elected for 4 years. That's one term. And originally, our U.S. Constitution didn't actually limit the number of terms that a president can serve. But you ended up having Franklin Delano Roosevelt that was actually going on his fourth term, and he ended up dying. And so they ended up changing that with the 22nd Amendment, which basically limits the president to only 2 elected terms.
And what's really interesting about this, and I'm going to be a history geek out for a second, is George Washington, when he was president, he actually set the precedent, meaning it wasn't an official law, but he only ran for 2 terms. And for over 100 years after that, everyone just followed along with that. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, I'm not going to do that. He kept on running over and over and over, and eventually, like Ms. Hall said, they had to make it an official law. So, okay. Now, the salary and benefits. Now, students are always surprised when we tell them this. The president makes about $400,000, and you would think it'd be a lot more because if you always look at a president's hair from when they start to when they end, it's always really gray because they have a lot of pressure on their shoulders, which, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense. But they do get to, I'm so sorry, they do get to fly on a very cool airplane, though, and that's called, again, Air Force One.
They do. Now, they do get some perks, so they'll have some traveling expenses for personal travel. They do get to live in the White House, which that has got to be absolutely amazing to me. They do have a staff that's going to jump in and assist them. They do have Camp David, which I just learned that it was under President Eisenhower that actually named it Camp David. It had some other funky name to it. And that's basically where it's not too far from the White House, but that's where the president can have some official business when they have leaders from other countries, or if he wants our own political leaders to meet him there. Trying to think. I think that's about it for that.
Yeah, I think that's about it. So now you want to move on to the vice president?
Sure.
Okay. So the vice president is elected with the president. Basically, they run together. Whenever the president is trying to become, or whenever someone's trying to become the president, they're always going to say, well, this person is going to be my vice president candidate. They're really tied together. Now, the vice president in our system doesn't have a ton of power. Instead, really their main job is that they oversee the Senate. But the only time that they can vote is if the Senate's in a tie. So again, that's the only time. Now, the other important job that the vice president has is, should the president leave office by dying or, again, through disgrace, then the vice president's really the first one to take over.
Right, and I kind of like to look at the vice president as an insurance policy. So the president will typically pick somebody that he can trust in case he were to have to move on.
Correct, exactly right. Okay.
Now, the Presidential Succession Act was basically an act that Congress had passed in 1947, and it basically listed the line of succession. So if the president dies, then the vice president becomes president. Then if the vice president dies, then that goes to the speaker, and so forth. And it'll go down the line: president pro tempore of the Senate, secretary of state, secretary of the Treasury, secretary of defense, and so forth. So there's actually a much longer list, but they wanted it official just in case something happened.
Absolutely. And do you want to do the 25th Amendment too? Because I kind of feel like it ties along very nicely with the presidential succession.
So remember, the word ratified means approved. And in 1967, they actually approved the 25th Amendment. And basically what this basically says is that if the president dies or leaves office, the vice president becomes president, and then the new president should choose a new vice president to help with Congress. And there's actually 2 steps to the process. And I think that our little paragraph here goes very nicely. For the first one, it says the new president names someone to the office. The Senate and the House must approve this choice. This amendment made another important change, and it basically gives the vice president a role of deciding whether a president is disabled and can't actually do the job. So they actually, if they actually think that the president is mentally gone, he can jump in there and make that decision. Excellent. So, and it also says Vice President George Bush served as acting president for actually 8 hours when President Reagan was actually needing surgery. So.
Very interesting. All right, so now we get to move on to some of the presidential enumerated powers. Now, again, guys, we will hopefully have gone over this over and over and over. However, the president's main job is to carry out laws that are passed by Congress. That is their main responsibility. Now, they have some other very important jobs that they do. First, they can veto bills in Congress. Meaning, again, they can essentially, after they've been passed, if the president doesn't like the bills, they can essentially reject them. They can call Congress into special sessions. They can serve as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Or they serve. They can serve. They serve, excuse me. They receive leaders and other officials of foreign countries, meaning they welcome it into the country. They can make treaties with other countries, although they have to have the approval of the Senate, of course. They can head the executive agencies, the federal court, and ambassadors, who are official representatives of our country's government, and other top officials. But again, they have to be approved by the Senate. They can pardon people or reduce penalties against people convicted of federal crimes. The Constitution requires the presidents to tell people about the State of the Union, which is basically a speech that the president gives, basically saying how the country's doing.
It's like their report card.
Exactly right. That's a really interesting way to put it. I didn't think about that, but you're exactly right. It is their report card.
So, presidential implied powers. Now, remember what implied means. It's not written out. It's not necessarily stated, but it's kind of insinuated. So, keep in mind, if this is the law, then you might have to do a couple of steps to enforce that. And so that president has that power to establish some steps in order for that law to happen. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Now, here's some implied powers that he actually has. He actually gets to select a cabinet. Now, what a cabinet is he has like 15 departments. And so every department has a leader. Mm-hmm. Well, he can't meet with every department. That would be hundreds and possibly thousands of people. So what he does is he'll meet with the leader of each department, and that's what he calls his cabinet. And they'll meet weekly. And so they will basically give advice to the president on their specialty area. So, he gets to select them. And again, who gets to approve them? The Senate. Mm-hmm. He can assert emergency powers during wartime. Keep in mind, presidents have basically kind of gone against the Constitution a little bit when wartime. Like, for instance, President Wilson during World War I actually limited free speech. FDR basically ordered descendants of Japan, even that were U.S. citizens, to go to an internment camp, during World War II. So number 3, it says presidents can issue executive orders. And it kind of has a force of law, but it's based on the responsibility of the president to execute laws passed by Congress. So in other words, if it's something that affects the federal government, in order for him to do his job, he can enact. The president can avoid getting the 2/3 approval of the Senate for passing treaties by making what's called an executive agreement. So basically, let's say, for instance, I'm president and I want to make a treaty with Vietnam. Congress says, or let's say the Senate says, I don't like that treaty. Well, if it's something that I feel strong enough about, I can say, okay, I get it. We won't make a treaty. I'll just make a side deal with that president of Vietnam. And that's kind of like an agreement between us. There's nothing really official about it. However, it's a verbal agreement between us. Engaging in conflicts around the world. Our president's job is to protect our nation, and our foreign policy has always been to stop the spread of communism. So basically, when we see our fellow allies out there being attacked and overrun by communism, we usually jump in. Okay. The War Powers Act. Now, this requires the president to report to Congress within 48 hours of a specific action against a country. And if the Congress doesn't approve it, they could say, actually, they have 60 days to approve it. If they don't approve it, then the president actually has to withdraw those troops. Okay?
Exactly right. Now, there's a ton, as we've already been over, you can see the president does a lot. So really, the president has a bunch of different roles that they have. First, right down here, they are the chief executive, which just means they're in charge of enforcing the laws. And again, Ms. Hull did a very good job talking about the different departments and the different cabinets which make up the president. The president is in charge of naming those people, those departments and agencies, and the Senate, again, has to approve them. In addition to that, the president serves as the chief diplomat, which just means the president decides how the U.S. acts towards other countries. They are the head of state, which means they are the living symbol of the nation. When you think of the U.S., oftentimes one of the first things you think of is the president. They are the commander-in-chief, which means they are in charge of the armed forces or the military. They are the legislative leader. And right here you can see only Congress can introduce bills, but they expect the president to propose new laws and have new ideas for new laws. They are the economic leader. Oftentimes, that's one of the most important things that you hear with the president. You hear the word economy a lot when you're watching the news. whether it's doing well or whether it's doing poor, because the president's really job, or part of their job, is to make sure, again, that the economy is doing well. In addition to that, they are the party leader, which just means they lead the political party and give speeches to help fellow party members running for office. So right now, President Trump is a Republican. He is the head of the Republican Party.
All right. Now, if you go to the next page, the title up there is really actually misleading because that's really the president's departments. I haven't listed the cabinet members there. You'll have a PowerPoint that we'll go over for that. But let's talk about the 15 different departments right quick. So you have the State Department. That is probably one of the main departments that you hear about all the time, because they basically are in charge of the foreign policy. They're out there on the ground constantly working with other countries, trying to solve issues between the nations. And oftentimes, the cabinet member for the State Department, they're out of the country well more than they're in our country. Department of Treasury, they're dealing with the money in our nation. Department of Defense, Armed Forces, obviously. Department of Justice, that's they're responsible for law enforcement, any type of law enforcement. Department of Interior, they basically manage the land and our natural resources within the United States. You have the Agricultural Department, and they assist the farmers and consumers of farm products. The Commerce Department supervises trade, promotes U.S. business and tourism. Then Department of Labor, they actually deal with working conditions and the wages of Americans. Department of Health and Human Services, they're going to work for the well-being and health of the Americans. Department of Housing and Urban Development, they deal with special needs and city issues. Department of Transportation manages our highways, railroads, airlines, sea traffic. Department of Energy directs overall energy plans for the nation. Department of Education, now let me state this. Nowhere in the U.S. Constitution does it state anything about the U.S. education. Therefore, that means it's reserved for the states. However, states do get financial help from the U.S. government.
Which just means they get money.
Right. And so really, the Department of Education will give advice and they give funding, and that's basically all they do. Department of Veteran Affairs, they basically look after our veterans that were in the military. And then, of course, Department of Homeland Security, which is actually the newest department. That one was created right after 9/11. They oversee our defense against terrorism. So keep in mind, the cabinet member of all of these departments constantly give advice to the president.
Yep.
And and if you look at it, they really broke down the main issues in our nation.
They did.
And they said, okay, for you guys, this one department's going to take care of one issue or one big idea, and then you're going to keep me updated on that. So it's efficient.
Yes, definitely is. All right. Now, in addition to that, the last thing that you really need to focus on when you're looking through this, there's some key terms. And I don't know how you want to do this, if you want to just go through one by one, because some of them, I mean, they're all important.
Why don't you do three? I'll do three.
Perfect. Sounds good. So the first one that we're going to go over, guys, is presidential appointment, which just means the power to select members of the executive branch and the judicial branch. And again, that's the president's power. The next one you hear is veto. Now, a veto is just the president rejecting a new law passed by Congress. And again, the president has that power, but likewise, if the president decides to veto a law, then Congress, as we learned in the previous chapter, has a way to overturn even that. So again, there's lots of checks and balances in our government. The next one you have is impeachment, which is just Congress can remove a higher official from power for wrongdoing. So if they do something very, very illegal or do something wrong, again, they can be impeached from office.
So pardon, this one's an interesting word because every president typically will do quite a few pardons at the very end of their presidency. That's basically just where they go in and they forgive and release certain people from prison.
And that's people from federal crimes, though, correct? Because again, the state government can pardon people committed of state crimes if they want, right? The government, yes. Okay, I just want to make sure.
Yeah, you're right. Good.
I'm very
amnesty.
smart.
Oh, I'm sure you are.
Very, very intelligent. Yeah.
Every once in a while, you prove that.
I don't like to brag about it too much, but in this particular case,
amnesty is basically when you take a group of people and you pardon them as a whole. And oftentimes you would hear amnesty kind of tied in with immigration, like people that came here illegally, but yet have lived here for several years. They typically will want amnesty. They want to be pardoned and provided the path to become a U.S. citizen. Foreign policy, again, is just a way that our nation deals with other nations. And basically we have a set plan of ideals of how we know what we're going to do in regards to handling other nations. And again, one of the main things is that we stop the spread of communism.
Exactly right. Now, the next term that we have here is national security. Now, all national security is just to keep the country safe from attack or harm. And Ms. Hall already went over that. They actually created, again, the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. So, again, we're just very concerned wanting to make sure we are safe as citizens. The next one is a treaty, which is a formal agreement between two or more countries. And, again, the Senate has to approve it. If the Senate does not approve it, then it's not a treaty. The last one we have is trade sanctions, which is an effort to punish another nation by imposing trade barriers. Now, one country that you're going to hear all the time in the news that has trade sanctions put on them is North Korea. And that's essentially our way of punishing them for human right abuse and, frankly, the way they act around other nations.
And one that you'll hear most about probably currently is China.
Yes, China, definitely.
Okay, embargo. Embargo is basically an agreement among a group of nations that prohibits them from trading with other nations. And that we often see with Iran. We oftentimes put embargoes on Iran by saying, okay, basically nobody, not our allies, can trade with them until they agree to do this, this, and this. Okay. Cabinet, we already talked about that. That's a group that advises the president. So each department has one leader. That's a cabinet member. And then, of course, nomination. A party actually selects who they want to run for president. Now, of course, we know it's the people because the people go in the primary election and they vote for who they want. But you basically have to get that okay from that political party.
All right. Excellent. Next, we have primary election. Now, before the general election, which is the election where, again, the members from each party run against one another, you have the primary election, which is deciding who's going to be the representative of each party. So, again, that is what was going on this previous year with Joe Biden, obviously, running against Bernie Sanders. They were trying to figure out who was going to be the representative of the Democratic Party and who was going to run against, again, President Trump right now, which takes us into the general election. The general election is when you have, again, one Republican and one Democrat, and they will run against one another. And, of course, you have the third-party members, too, or third-party candidates as well. Now, the last one is civil service system, which is just hiring government workers on the basis of open, competitive examinations and proven ability.
Okay, so merit system. Now, this is basically a system where they look at people for how qualified they are. In other words, have you passed this test? Do you meet these certain standards? And, nothing else applies. You've got to be able to check off the boxes and rank high to be selected for something like this. Embassy, that's basically in every country, just about, not every, well, I shouldn't say every country, but most countries we have an embassy.
Mm-hmm.
Technically, that's a little building, piece of land, and that land is technically U.S. soil.
Correct.
And that's where our main office, where our diplomats and ambassadors will basically work from when they're in that country dealing with the other country's ambassadors. Now, I will say this. It's interesting because years ago when I was traveling in college, I got my passport stolen in London. And I had to, of course, go to the embassy, and that's where they would reissue me another passport.
Correct.
What a nightmare. Doctrine will probably touch just a little bit because we eventually get into this in regards to chapter 17 or
I think so. Right.
But it basically a stated belief mainly in military or foreign affairs. And Monroe, which was one of our presidents, basically established this in 1823, stating that any intervention by any other powers outside the U.S. in the politics of America is potentially a hostile act towards the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically that's, really what Russia was being accused of. However, it boiled down to just as much China. China would never want President Trump to be elected because he's willing to make things fair as far as when it comes to trade relations with China.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
All right. We hope you guys enjoyed the video. We'll talk to you guys later.